we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time listening, welcome. If not, welcome back. Like I always say, if you ever wanted to reach out to the podcast, let us know if you want to hear topics or anything like that. Hit us up on our Instagram or our Twitter at the Bigmark Pod or at the Bigmark Podcast. If you ever wanted to support the podcast, check out our Patreon, patreon.com/the Bigmark Podcast. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you subscribe to our channel and like the video and, share with your friends if you like it. If we tell one friend, we can grow the podcast, we can double it overnight. And again, I appreciate everyone listening. I appreciate everyone who's ever listened and supports, and all our patrons, whatever you want to call them. Thank you so much. You guys keep us going and keep the lights on, and super exciting. Always glad to be here. And again, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching wherever you are. I wanted to do today's topic. I was really looking forward to it, and it's a topic that I've thought a lot about and didn't know exactly how to tackle here. And I guess maybe it somewhat falls under one of those kind of larger branches, but I kind of wanted to talk about the fantasy genre in general, not necessarily just like any fantasy, but obviously all that is kind of like, encompassing in what it is. And again, like I said, I wanted to talk mostly about the genre. So TVs, movies, books, everything that's fantasy, as we all know, fucking Dungeons and Dragons. I mean, all that stuff. I guess it's just an interesting kind of another little symbol for, imagination, really, using your imagination in a very kind of free, uninhibited way. And it's pretty interesting. I was looking into things. I actually looked up the actual definition of the genre. And basically, it kind of comes down to basically anything involving magical elements. So obviously, that covers quite a broad range. But it's magical elements that are typically set in a fictional universe. So not only are the characters, imaginative, but the entire universe that they're set in and the rules of said universe, tend to be again, fictional. Excuse me, completely made up. And you could even look at comics in this sense and say that they're a type of fantasy because they exist in a world where fucking superheroes exist. But anyway, they're also inspired by mythology and folklore, which is really interesting because, fantasy's roots really do lie in those oral traditions. And we'll kind of go into a little bit more of that in depth. The one thing with fantasy, because obviously it kind of comes up, it is distinguished from sci-fi and horror by basically the absence of scientific or macabre themes. And now the problem with fantasy, and we'll get into some of the subgenres, is that a lot of those things do overlap. But essentially, the biggest differences between fantasy and sci-fi is that sci-fi is involving, basically very specific scientific themes. Like I mentioned, fantasy themes have been around since stories were first told. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Many of these stories, Homer, Odyssey, and he's fighting fucking, Cyclops and Hydras and things like that. Like, obviously, there's something about that, and it comes, like I mentioned, from that oral tradition and mythology and the way that stories were passed down from generation to generation. And it's interesting because a lot of those stories, served a function, and there was a function of myth. And Joseph Campbell talks about this, but the idea is that these myths were being told to people who, this is oral tradition. This is before we wrote anything down. So you had to remember everything. And basically, storytellers of old and the myth makers, if you will, came up with these stories so that people would remember them and tie memories to these feelings. And, you know, when they're being told around a campfire or somewhere where you have, it's not just you're remembering something that's written down, because obviously nothing was written down, but you're not just reading something, you have to remember it. You're remembering the entire story and that whole thing. And it helps you actually understand. So like, you know, a lot of creation myths talk about the sun and you know, pagan myths, and they talk about how seasons change and things like that. And a lot of those stories were actually being told to help people stay on track with those seasons changing, so that you could, you know, grow your crops in a certain way and things like that, and understanding that there's passages of time and obviously morals and learning values and things like that in society were really important in myths and those stories that were being handed down. And again, even a lot of the stories in religions and things like that, they serve functions. They're trying to teach you lessons, you know, more, like I said, the moral of the story, that whole idea, you know, that's the function of myth. And fantasy, you know, the fantasy genre always pulls kind of from that kind of aspect, right? And there is, you know, there are kind of like learning lessons. You know, a little bit of the history of modern fantasy kind of really all starts with George MacDonald. He was the first guy to really kind of bring some of those ancient kind of ideas into modern literature. I mean, this was back in 1858, but he wrote The Princess and the Goblin and Fantasies. And The Princess and the Goblin essentially was more or less a story of this young girl who goes into a town and she finds a mine and there's goblins happening, which we'll get into a bit in one of the subgenres of fantasy. That's a very big recurring theme when people are kind of entering into a portal and going through into a different world from our normal reality and entering into the world. And again, that is a major theme that we'll talk about in a second. And then he wrote another story, Fantasies, like I mentioned, which was again, that was kind of one of the first ideas of even where the name of the genre even kind of came from, because it was Fantasies with a PH, and you know, slowly, as we know, became fantasy as we know it. MacDonald was a major influence on J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis, which obviously were major fantasy writers. And obviously there's hundreds of other fantasy writers that, you know, I could mention, but I'm not going to, because no one else really defined the genre really than J.R.R. Tolkien. Obviously with The Hobbit, Lord of the Rings, The Silmarillion, and Unfinished Tales. He's written other books, but I wanted to focus on this whole universe, this Lord of the Rings universe, if you will, because it's so comprehensive, and the lore that he came up with. And again, a lot of it, yeah, it's based off Norse mythology and a lot of other tales and stuff. But again, that's what defines the genre, is that everything that's kind of put into this, you know, he invented languages, you know, from Elven to Dwarfish to whatever the Uruk were speaking. I don't know if he actually wrote much of what their words, the Black speak or whatever, but Elven is like a full comprehensive language, like people study it. And then you can look at fucking Gene Roddenberry and stuff and what he did with Klingon and the Star Trek kind of lore too, right? So this is the thing. This is where fantasy does become something that's so special, where they become masterpieces in just function themselves, because you have to think out so many different angles and all the different ways and how things function. And yes, again, it's fantasy and you're using your imagination. But like I'll mention again in one of the subgenres, you know, some fantasy does kind of exist in this realm where you want it to be somewhat believable. But again, the entire, just the world that was created in just the literature alone, let alone what, Peter Jackson did and everyone else did with the movie adaptations. But again, just, with history and things that you're not just going to come up with something that, it's just a cool story and there's something like that. Because as I'll go into in a little bit more, Joseph Campbell kind of talks about those classic stories and those archetypal stories that do exist, and just the themes and stuff that Tolkien does touch on in Lord of the Rings especially are just so universal. And again, I'll get to it in a moment, but just the way the fantasy genre is able to push through that or not necessarily push through that, but create a stage, create a platform that you can create a universe where certain things don't exist. It can be a futuristic universe where we've gotten over certain aspects of life, or again, it's creating somewhat of a blank slate or somewhat of a different kind of backdrop that you can look at problems that we see in society and look at them in a different kind of fashion when you're watching from afar in this kind of omnipotent position. Anyway, like I said, I'll get into it in a minute, because I do want to get into the fantasy classification, because I've mentioned it a couple of times, and I thought it was really cool because I stumbled across it in my research. Because again, fantasy isn't necessarily something I always go to. Again, I love Lord of the Rings. I mentioned before. I'm hoping to do more and more podcasts. I've been watching Rings of Power, and I've been watching New House of Dragon too. So again, super fantasy stuff, right? Stuff that exists right now, contemporary stuff that I want to talk about. It's just the series aren't done yet. But again, this is what kind of led me to talking about the entire genre. But I thought it was really interesting about these fantasy classifications, and there's so many more. I'm not going to mention them all right now. We don't have, all the time in the world. But again, there's something interesting when I did some of the across all these subgenres. You look at that whole aspect that I touched on before of that. This is true imagination, right? In your kind of, entering into worlds or creating worlds that they've never existed before, or your characters are able to do things that other characters wouldn't. And again, kind of all comes from these classifications. Again, like some of the notable genres that I did come across, contemporary fantasy, which is, kind of set in a modern world, where, some of these things I tried to think of some examples of, right? And, obviously like kind of more like maybe comic book kind of stuff comes to, maybe Hellboy, that whole story of, it's in a contemporary world, but there's ancient kind of things afoot. Dark fantasy, which again, that was where when I mentioned where things do kind of cross over in, horror and those macabre themes do kind of come into fantasy, which usually kind of separates the two genres. But again, sometimes they do fit, and it's always great to see genres cross over. A fable, which I thought was an interesting style of fantasy story. What actually distinguishes a fable is that it's using non-humans, which I thought was really interesting, because Fable A was a really fucking sick Xbox game back in the day. But two, of course, I thought of fucking Shrek, which is hilarious. But again, where I touched on just a moment ago, where fantasy uses divisive, fantastical, imaginative characters that allow you to kind of frame things, in Shrek, as the example, Shrek himself being an ogre, you can really lean into those grumpy kind of like nasty characteristics, because it's a fucking ogre, and everyone's like, oh duh, he can be over the top and ogre-like because he's a fucking ogre, and then when other things happen to him along the way, the lessons become magnified. I think that's what I'm kind of getting at. Stick with me, people. Gaslamp Fantasy. Sorry, I've been fucking listening to too much History Hyenas. Gaslamp Fantasy, which I thought was interesting. I almost thought it was Gaslight Fantasy, which is like, I don't know what that means. Maybe someone's trying to tell you that it is a fantasy, but it's not. I don't know. Is like kind of more like Victorian, Edwardian, that kind of, I don't even know a good, like, this is again where kind of horror and stuff kind of do mix there, because Dracula and things like that obviously come to mind, and another Guillermo del Toro movie, whatever, Crimson Peaks, all that kind of stuff comes to mind. Hard fantasy, which again, like I mentioned before, requires a lot of explanation of how the actual mechanics, if you will, of the fantasy world exist. So it's internally consistent and it's explainable. Whatever happens in the world is completely explainable. Maybe more in literature, you kind of find that kind of stuff. That kind of goes hand in hand with high fantasy, epic themes. Again, obviously Lord of the Rings, perfect example of that. Conversely, obviously, if there's high fantasy, there's also low fantasy, which is actually really interesting, which is like very few supernatural elements. So I guess it's more on the continuum of just kind of being like a fictional story at that point. But maybe Stranger Than Fiction, the movie, Will Ferrell movie, tremendous movie, one of my favorites, where there's somewhat of, because there's this narrator that he's hearing, but it's not like super magic. It's super, maybe that's a good example. Maybe not. Another thing that was really interesting, that Farrell Mendelson, the literature professor, if you will, she actually came up with the idea that you can classify fantasy by the function of the fantastic in the narrative itself. So all those other classifications was just kind of based on like, plot points and things like that. But this is kind of what's actually, you're classifying on how the fantasy actually works in the world. So I kind of mentioned this before, but portal fantasies where, a fantastical world is entered. So obviously, Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, Narnia comes to mind there, where you're entering into this world. Maybe even Nightmare Before Christmas, where there's a threshold that you're crossing. And again, we'll mention that in a second. But that kind of whole idea where you're entering into this world of imagination within the story itself, it's almost this whole meta thing that's kind of happening, which is really cool. Immersive fantasy, which basically doesn't question the fantastic elements. So, I guess Harry Potter might be a decent example of that because, well, I don't know, maybe because there's a lot of questioning, but no one's questioning like where magic came from or if magic is real per se. But, kind of the idea that I'm saying that because, people exist in this magic world. Like, yeah, muggles and all that thing might be not the best example, but again, no one's, when you're, Expelliarmus something, or you fucking Wingardium Leviosa some shit and starts floating, you're not going like, oh, how did that, like, that's not real, that's explained by some physical aspect. So, again, immersive fantasy where it's just, that's what the world is, and everything that happens isn't necessarily questioned, it's just there to help drive the plot. Intrusive fantasy, on the other hand, is actually where the fantastic intrudes on reality. So in the research, it was talking about Dracula. Bram Stoker's Dracula, for instance, is a example of that, where, what the fuck's the guy's name? Jonathan something. The main dude in Bram Stoker's Dracula, where he goes over Jonathan Pryce or some bullshit like that. Anyway, he goes over there just on like some normal errand for some insurance company, and he ends up getting sucked into, the world of Dracula. And then the Liminal Fantasy, where the world appears to be our own, and the marvelous is perceived as normal by the protagonists, but still fantastical to the reader. So again, maybe Harry Potter almost falls more into that character category where, well, in many instances in the book, Harry is experiencing that liminal fantasy because he's going, holy shit, where all these other people like the Weasleys that are used to doing magic are like, yeah, this is normal. But I'm sure there's many better examples out there, but I always thought that when I read that, I thought that one was really interesting. What was the book I read? It was like a young spy. He was like Artemis Fowl. That was a really, really interesting series. There was a few books in that. I didn't finish the series, but kind of wish I did maybe. But that was really interesting in the sense that there were kind of fantastical elements to that just were kind of splashed in, and no one was like, hey, how the fuck is there a dwarf doing this thing over here? But again, I really thought that was a cool way of kind of splitting up and looking at fantasy, because again, like I said, it's this idea that you are using your imagination in its full capacity, and my general thoughts on fantasy. Now, like I mentioned, I really love Lord of the Rings. I think what Tolkien did is fantastic. I think the Peter Jackson movies are fantastic. I think The Hobbit's not bad. Everything is so cool, and maybe it's because it's the OG, and maybe I have something in my heart about the OG, or again, in some instances, I just kind of think that everything else is just a Lord of the Rings ripoff. Now, this is probably going to be a controversial opinion for many people my age, but I think I think Game of Thrones is not bad. I think some of the elements in Game of Thrones for myself personally are really tough to get over. And I get it, and it's provocative, and it is cool, and fucking dragons are rad and all that shit, but I was never really that kid. I was never that, I want to be a knight. Medieval times was fun as shit, but again, I wasn't really into that whole, again, medieval times-esque thing where, knights and old England and all that kind of idea, right? But again, Lord of the Rings was cool. Just, again, I think I really did appreciate just the world that was created, right? And it was so dynamic, and so many different, traditional, archetypal aspects of the story that just made sense. And, in most of my enjoyment of Lord of the Rings, I was probably too young to understand like some of the references potentially to war and things like that. But also, Tolkien himself said, he didn't really write it in reference to anything. Yeah, there's different themes of evil and things that are actually truly universal, and they don't actually have anything to do with with what actually happened in World War I and what Tolkien experienced. I think some of the stuff that he went through, it can't help but come through, especially when he's talking about battle-esque things / conflicts and whether it's on a personal level, feeling the conflict, or whether it's on a global political level too. And like I said, from what I've read, Tolkien said it had nothing to do with it, but a lot of the analysis of Lord of the Rings, you look at, some of the neutral countries that didn't take a side in World War I, and well, I guess that was pushing into World War II, which obviously Tolkien didn't write about that, but again, just the warfare alone and the feelings of despair and feelings of loss and good versus evil, again, kind of just come through the story naturally. But again, you know, I it's just not something I reach for. It's not like I've read a lot of books in the style of fantasy. Again, maybe I lean maybe towards sci-fi a little bit more. But yeah, really, when I think about things, I kind of do lean towards nonfiction. So again, sometimes fantasy just doesn't really grab me in the way that I would like, I guess. But at the same time, is I think Stranger Things kind of pop things up and stuff, but like stuff like Dungeons and Dragons that's been around, obviously that's the essence of fantasy. I would love to be into that kind of thing. Shout out to my boy Zangus and like everyone at Escarpment Labs who's down with it. It's just like, I don't know, maybe the way my imagination works in that sense, I'm okay to appreciate it, but maybe I do lean towards some of that more hard fantasy where things are a little bit more explainable and come from somewhat of a root of reality, which, if it's in fucking reality, it's not a fantasy anymore. So anyway, those are kind of just like how I feel about things. But in doing this research and just thinking about it, I really do appreciate the genre completely, because again, it just allows you to create these, having these themes based on completely fabricated, completely imaginative worlds. You can really take different perspectives on things and take a human element out of things, which I think in some ways it doesn't dumb down things. In some ways it actually adds layers to things, but it allows us to perceive maybe some of the things that humans do and the challenges we face in life, or the ideas and feelings that we have when they're presented in this kind of realm. We're able to unpack it a little bit easier, or at least look at it from kind of more of a 10,000 foot approach, if you will. But I mentioned Joseph Campbell already, and a lot of what happens in fantasy, I think, again, because it comes from myth, it always really follows a lot of the things that Joseph Campbell said. So one of his big things was he talks about, when I talked about the function of myth, that was one of the things that Joseph Campbell always spoke of. But one of the biggest things that comes up in fantasy a lot is the monomyth, or in other words, the hero's journey. So it's this idea that there is, throughout cultures, throughout history, there are these stories and these archetypes and these themes that come up in stories since we've been telling stories. And it's something that touches us deep inside, and I hope anyone listening to this knows exactly what I'm talking about, because it's almost something I can't really put into words. And there's a quote that I want to leave you with here in a second from Joseph Campbell. But I want to go into the hero's journey a little bit more, because it's such an interesting thing. And when you kind of break it down, you can kind of see how it really is, a tale of life. And Joseph Campbell also calls it, the story of the hero of 1,000 faces, right? It doesn't matter who the actual character is. That hero is going through that same kind of experience. And the breakdown, more or less, of the hero's journey is it starts with the hero, and there's a call to adventure. So again, think of any story when I'm kind of telling this, right? There's a call to adventure where the hero has to set out and leave, their home where they're comfortable. There's some type of supernatural aid, again, which lends itself to fantasy. there's a crossing over the threshold from the known to the unknown. So like I said, they're leaving home, they're leaving the things that they know and people that they know. And along the way, there's guardians of the threshold, and you have to either prove yourself somehow, or the journey itself might prove something to these guardians. But again, you have to kind of get past and past the threshold of the known into the unknown. And at that point, it is the beginning of the transformation. And usually, just as the hero is starting out into the unknown, they're joined by a helper, they're joined by a mentor of some type. And along that journey through the unknown, there's challenges and temptations. The helper helps along the way, obviously. And the helper basically helps you to finally cross over into the abyss, or what Joseph Campbell calls the abyss, which is some type of death and rebirth, whether it's a true death of the character or a death of attitude, or a death of thinking, or a death of the world that they know of, and then a rebirth and a revelation of things that they've been either doing wrong, or a whole new revelation of something that they never thought about. Along with that comes a transformation and an atonement. Again, these are all just like elements that you always see throughout history. You see these stories over and over again. And then a return from the unknown to the known, and with a gift from the goddess, which I always think of, obviously, Galadriel giving gifts to the fellowship there. But all those themes there, it's hard, and hats off to Joseph Campbell for actually trying to put them into words. But I think it's interesting that how that whole story there, you kind of feel that, and you kind of understand that, or where, maybe there's a big life change, that something that happens in your life, or again, something, just general feelings in life. And if you look at your own story, or other people that who have gone through different things, maybe they're at different parts of that hero's journey. And there's many different ways to kind of understand that, and maybe that helps give yourself a different perspective of other people's plights, if you will. But I want to leave you with a quote from Joseph Campbell here, which is really interesting. I think it's going to open up some more ideas afterwards, but I thought it was really cool. Joseph Campbell says, "God is a metaphor for a mystery that absolutely transcends all categories of thought, even the categories of being and non-being." Those are categories of thought. I mean, it's as simple as that. So it depends on how much you want to think about it, whether it's doing you any good, whether it's putting you in touch with that mystery that's ground on your own being. If it isn't, well, it's a lie. So half the people in the world are religious people who think their metaphors are facts. Those are what we call theists. And the other half are people who know that the metaphors are not facts, and so they're lies. And those are atheists. And I think, again, like I said, it's going to open up more questions, really. But the essence of, it's something that speaks deep into you. And whether that is God, and whether that you go with that, and that's part of what you think, that's totally fine too. But even the people who call themselves atheists, they still wonder what those, like Joseph Campbell says, what those lies actually mean. What are those mysteries? What are those archetypes that really do speak to the deepest part of us? And we do feel that kind of feeling. And I think when we look inside each other, there's so many themes that are there, and it's kind of one of those things where whether that is that collective unconscious or whatever it might be, there's something that we all share. We all share these experiences, and that is truly, reflected in fantasy. And I think when when we do, whether we're reading a fantasy novel or watching something, a fantasy movie or TV show, I think when we truly give into that, it allows us to kind of tap into some of those universal truths and those universal knowledges. And again, there's something about those stories that need to be told. Why do we have these myths? Why do we have these things that just have to be passed down? And if we can be part of that, and if we can witness, again, something like Lord of the Rings, and we can witness that has become such a masterwork and such an epic thing that has transcended generations, but probably will transcend time, in the sense that it is delivering ideas and delivering a story that is uplifting, heartbreaking, but also, teaches you things that are universal. And again, we just need to we need, sometimes it needs to be in a cool little package with knights and dragons and elves and dwarves sometimes, and that's okay. Go find your favorite fantasy novel. Honestly, let me know. I'd love to hear some cool books and movies and TV shows. Hit me up. Hit up our Twitter or our Instagram at the Bigmark Pod, at the Bigmark Podcast. Again, thank you so much for watching, and wherever you're watching, please rate the podcast if you can. Give us 5 stars. I know it doesn't seem like much, but it does mean a lot to the podcast. If you're watching on YouTube, hit that notification button, subscribe to the channel so you know when our next videos are coming out. Again, tell your friends, share the podcast. If you ever wanted to donate to the podcast, hit up our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. Again, thank you so much for listening. I appreciate it. Find your favorite fantasy and follow it. FFF, baby. Peace.